famous EOVs, I'm not so sure. So I'll try my best to bring some of the drier content of EOVs through to you. And this will really try and define the section of SOOS's developmental goals, and through the implementation, it's really around its first objective. And so by providing just a bit of a background on where it's come from, this will lead very nicely into Andrew's talk, which will take some in-depth view at the ecosystem EOVs, and then Matt, after that, about the sampling strategies that actually need to be implemented to optimally sample the EOVs. So this is just a background. I think I won't need my full time slot, so the other guys can have a bit of extra bit to discuss theirs. So, well, you know, we've seen this now. Anna took us through this very nicely last night, and now into the idea of the strategic plan. And so we've come to an area of needing to know what exactly we're going to measure. And that's really crucial. You can imagine all these wonderful disciplines and areas that we want to understand better. But if we don't have an integrated and agreed to assessment of what we're going to measure exactly, and have a process by which we come to terms with those, you know, we're not going to make very much progress in this area. And so that really brings up this key objective of SOOS, which is facilitating the design and implementation of SOOS through understanding the EOVs. And for the Southern Ocean-wise, we really also cannot measure everything. It's too expensive, it's logistically impossible. And so, and we actually don't need to measure everything. We need to measure the key variables that are going to help us understand the Southern Ocean better, and also understand how it might be changing. So that's really the detecting, tracking, and attributing change in the Southern Ocean by selecting these key Central Ocean variables. And so if we look into the 20-year vision, you can see that moving from that kind of picture of looking at all those disciplines to having an implemented SOOS cannot be done without going through understanding what EOVs need to be measured, how they're going to be measured, how often, and when. So if I take just a little step back, many of you will understand this kind of process, but for those who don't, the framework for ocean observing came out of Ocean Obs in 2009, and that really provides a basis to identify what needs to be measured within observing systems. And I point you to a comprehensive publication by Eric Lindstrom in 2012, which goes through FOO. And here I just describe this, one of the first figures from FOO, which shows that to address the societal issues, we have to understand what to measure. And these would be done through finding out what are the EOVs, so that they can be brought into an observing platforms or arrays or experimental setups, fed into a data stream to understand the system better, that is fed back into readdressing the new societal problems that we might have. And FOO provided a very nice sort of framework to develop these EOVs from when they might be at a very concept stage, which we basically are at right now. The EOVs are, in most systems, still in a concept stage. And then bringing those further into a better maturity and a better readiness level into the pilot stage, and then eventually when they're actually a mature stage. And that runs from the community level where we are kind of today, and eventually gets to the regional and global agreed upon EOVs that need to take place. So this has, come out of obviously global observing systems such as GOOSE and others, but the Southern Ocean is very unique. And so when we look at the current available lists of EOVs for global observing systems, they don't always fit in with the Southern Ocean. The Southern Ocean is, a very unique place. It's not as accessible. We have to be realistic about what we're going to observe and how. And it requires different sampling resolutions, and that's where I said Matt is going to fill us in a little bit more on that afterwards. and it has specific regional components which might require specific EOVs. And so the question is, what are the fundamental variables that underpin the Southern Ocean system and its associated change? And I've got an example here, and I mean, it's the one that we throw around a lot in the SSC and at SOOS is iron. So iron, trace metal iron is extremely difficult to measure. But as a community, we have to assess how important is it that we constrain the iron cycle and its impacts on the biogeochemistry. And, I would say definitely we've got to do iron. And, through community-led discussion, we need to understand, is it really an EOV because it's difficult to measure, there's very few samples currently available, et cetera, et cetera. So I just go back to the SOOS strategic plan, which Anna introduced this morning. And within there, in the strategic plan, is objective 1. And it's split up into these key result areas that are founded by the SOOS, by the EOV process. And so I won't go through all the details underneath them, but I'll just take you through these first 3 key result areas of objective 1. And that is to, first of all, identify the Southern Ocean EOVs. And that's a process-driven way that we'll undertake it, that is guided by structures such as FOO and GOOSE. And so once those are agreed on, they can be made available, for example, on the SOOS website and through to the community otherwise, and then and addressed within each of the science themes around and through cross-cutting topics. And the example there is the SE fluxes, which we hope that this year will make a lot of progress in the SE flux workshop happening in September, which will start to draft actually the EOVs within the SE flux domain. The second one then is actually looking at the sampling requirements required for specific EOVs. So that's identified and agreed to. And so then the success indicator there would be that the sampling strategy is available to the community, and that task teams and working groups will then work through these to understand what are the best sampling requirements required for those EOVs. And then third is a strategy for the uptake of EOVs within the regional working groups is actually adopted. And so that each of the working groups can then plan how the EOVs fit into the regional observing plans. And the working groups then can detail this out in annual reports or otherwise as an indicator. So the EOVs, are sectioned within the different disciplines. And so the current status, and not all of this is exactly right and up to date, but at least within the physical realm, the physical oceanography, is that generally the parameters have been accepted. And well, I thought they were accepted until we met yesterday and we had the breakout sessions at looking at the EOVs with the data people, the data group, and we realized, there was actually some contention about certain aspects. And so it's largely accepted, but still requires some consultation. The biogeochemical ones are a little bit more complicated and difficult to define. And there again, for example, iron. And then the biological ones is, of course, really complex and really not well matured yet, and are at a sort of pre-pilot phase of being defined. So that's currently where we are, and we really need actually this week to look at these EOVs again and actually come to some agreements where possible on the EOVs that would be incorporated into SOOS. And so again, I just bring up this thing of where we would be with those EOVs, how we're going to prioritize them, and which ones are really essential that we start maturing them through this readiness level structure that's been set up by FOO. So we have the candidate list that is actually available. You can see it on the 3-year report of SOOS that's been distributed. And if you haven't got a copy yet, there's some on the table outside. And they have this page of candidate list of EOVs. And many of these has already this week been adjusted quite considerably. So this is just a candidate list. I just want to reiterate that. None of these are set in stone, and that's what we require as a community to agree on. is which ones do we want to add more, or do some of these need to be removed or amalgamated into other areas? And they're not exactly in order, but there's sort of a list of physical ones, and then it sort of goes into this blue area. I just put these blue colors to kind of help you. That's more around the sea ice and cryosphere, and then the biological ones. So, yeah, and so really eventually is that once completing this first objective will go a long way to actually foreseeing a SOOS observing system. And so to give some perspective on this week, and we can come back to this or discuss it, might be different, is that we need some consultation within the breakouts and within the working groups on defining the EOVs. So what else have we got here? We've got areas that, so some EOVs, and talking to Andrew earlier, is, he has a very good point, is that in fact, ones that are really not well developed and not mature yet, and that's really around the ecosystem ones, might require a dedicated working group. That obviously, because that's required past the sort of 1 year task team deadlines to mature and actually come back with a proper list of ecosystem EOVs. So that could be an idea of having a workshop associated with those. Whereas the task teams could be used to define the other ones that are quite well developed, for example, the ones in the physics. And I'll show you now that we've taken the template that's derived by Goose to start filling those out so that you may be able to use those with consultation with the SSC of SOOS to mature them and get them out of their actual candidate stage. So this is really a process-driven approach with some review and consultation. It's not supposed to be an administrative burden, but it does require, traceable ways at which we, come up. When we see this EOV in the list, how did we actually come up with finalizing that EOV? It doesn't require a call. This is an ongoing process. EOVs can be proposed or removed as we go along in a timeline. And what we were talking about a little bit this morning was that maybe the SSC could be grouped into EOV areas, so like it's already kind of defined in the physics or biological domains, and that there'll be individual expertise within the SSC, within those groups, that can be consulted from the community when there's issues around EOVs or need some discussion about how we're going to define those EOVs. And that could be placed potentially on the website, Louise, as the groups, what are the groups of EOV areas and who are the experts that could be consulted, whether it be physics, physical oceanography, or the sea ice, etc., or the air sea flux. And then there's the EOV templates, which could then go back to the SSC to be assessed and coordinated and given priority. And so this is, if you haven't seen it, this is kind of the template that comes out of the Goose framework and FOOM. And so each candidate EOV requires some background and rationale. And then there's some associated derived products and supporting variables and who would be the contacts and the lead people or groups, organizations that are associated with those EOVs. And so the action there, again, as I reiterate, is to discuss this further, to have the task teams that might fill out these EOV templates for further consultation within SOOS. So that's really it. I didn't think EOVs would get a hand clap. So I don't know if you, I only needed 15 minutes or so, but I don't know if there's any particular points. Yes, Sir Guy.
This is a point that's probably for the SA to raise it, because I think this is the most acute raising it. But if we're serious that we're looking at a 20-year time scale for SOOS, at least we're looking 20 years ahead, two things we can predict with confidence are going to happen in that 20 years. The technology is going to be enhanced, and indeed there will be, I'm sure, in the next 20 years, entirely new observations that can be made that can't be made now. That's point one. Point two is that discoveries will be made which will indicate a need to change or add an EOV that perhaps is not even considered at the moment, not even known about. Some minor turns out to be a really important proxy for a really important phenomenon. The issue that I'm raising is that the capacity of SOOS, the working groups, to flexibly change, to adapt to developments of that kind. Now, I'm not suggesting that the wheel should be reinvented every year, but it seems to me it might be worth thinking about every working group having a standard clause in its terms of reference saying review any fundamental changes that require us to reconsider an EOV or in addition to one, or reconsider our capacity to take advantage of new technology. It's a structural thing, but need to be complicated, but it just needs to be thought about at this stage, I would have thought.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a wonderful point. And this is, the list of EOVs can never be fixed. And of course, there will be new ones that are going to be fed in and require the community to look at. And I think SOOS will be really a space by which those can be fed into, to be reviewed, and we could work on how often we would come together and review them, or specific experts within the SSC might take that on to take new EOVs as they evolve into the future. And it's definitely not a fixed list. It needs to be it needs to morph as technologies increase and as research increases, and we need to understand and we need to measure certain other variables. And the EOVs, at this stage, there could be EOVs there that we can't really measure right now, and they drive the capabilities, they drive the new technologies for an observing system. So, it's sort of back and forth. Some might actually already be there that can't properly be measured and are going to be enhancing those capabilities. So I think that's something that definitely requires discussion, is how we will take in new applications for EOVs on a community level.
Do you have a waiting list, so to speak?
Do we have it?
You mentioned, and I can think just off the top of my head, there are variables which we would like to measure, which we don't, but we would like to have that information. Is there a waiting list, sort of we would really like to have this, but it doesn't exist?
Well,
I mean, EOVs are really for what we're doing, what we're going to be right now implementing, but it seems to me that there is a pretty clear, there are some ones that we could articulate very clearly that would be very valuable that as yet are sort of waiting for the technology to be able to implement. And an acknowledged waiting list would let more people who are working on developing the technology point over and say, hey, they want this. They would love it if we could provide this sort of information on a more large-scale basis.
Well, I think food provides that framework in terms of levels of readiness too. They could be, in that sense, pre-pilot stage variable that sits there and it's realized how important it is to measure it, and then we find the way to actually measure it, and then it goes up a level in that sense and gets categorized. Maybe that's where you would see is the waiting list area of the, I'm not sure.
Oscar is sort of a case of that where, if we want to, let's say, have a more synoptic view beyond like a geotraces perspective, we're not there yet technologically, but we know
we would like to be.
It's really important, and so what we want to do, I think, is also like not cut things off, but stratify them that way. So those that are ready and mature who go into climate models and that we charge ahead. For those, I mean, for a lot of the biology ones, it's like you go to these biology meetings and Andrew will talk about it, and it's diversity, or something like that, and that's still a work in progress.
In the Goose framework, there was trying to figure out which EOVs you use. There was two axes. One is, and we've already heard the maturity, is it ready to deploy now, and what's the value of the measurement? And in that framework, there's a lot of measurements which are very valuable, but we don't have the capability to make. So they don't score high in terms of being deployed today, but they do score high in the point you just made, that these are things that need attention so that they will become mature, because they're important measurements, but we can't make them today.
Yeah, I would say that the list of candidates that we actually had up there would also include some variables that do have high impact but low feasibility in terms of what we can actually observe now. So that list of candidates probably does have variables in there that are on the waiting list.
I don't know, my scan of it though was that they were pretty much operational, most of them, and that to more or less degrees, that there were ones that I might have included that as a modeler I'm desperate for, but which I understand, particularly given the sparse platforms available in the Southern Ocean, it might be very important, but not actually operationally
Could you give an
feasible.
example?
Yeah, it'd be good to get that feedback because we didn't actually have a lot of modelers included in the discussion of development of these, so having that input is Did you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of what particular ones you have in mind on top of your head, that people could, just to give an idea of what's not measured.
If you wanted to put the list back up, that'd be fine, but it's, I'm not sure if I'm not just, reinventing the wheel here, because I didn't have a chance to really, I read through and I thought I didn't see some of the flux and surface winds and wave heights and energy budget type parameters,
Yes,
mixing. There's a whole bunch of ones which we absolutely need in order to, even things like ridiculous things like eddy kinetic energy and other stuff which I need in order to do a proper budget.
Yeah, so
But
I mean,
which
somewhat derived variables, and I suppose we have to be careful about how many are actually making onto the.
like surface fluxes.
I mean, but eddy kinetic energy,
Yeah.
it's a derived variable. So I mean, I don't see that being really an EOV in that sense. The sea surface height is, and that's one that we've discussed actually this week again. And but it's the eddy kinetic energy in that sense.
I mostly was thinking connection to the atmosphere.
Yeah, so the SC Flux workshop is happening, like I mentioned in September, and that's going to be really the key to developing the initial list of EOVs that are not on SC Fluxes in Southern Ocean, in the SOOS one. There's huge gaps there, you can see it straight away. And so that's going to then tie into the physical ones and some biogeochemical ones when that gets developed later this year. But yeah, you're going to be joining that task team for SE Flux EOVs. I can see it. Just pencil your name down there.
No, I'm on SORP, so I'm going to be there anyway.
Okay,
So.
great, yes. Okay. But yeah, Andrew, is going to cover some more aspects that are being raised now, I think, in his talk as well.
Just a short comment on there. I think when we had the discussions earlier in the week, everything to do with ARC flux was kind of put on the side because this workshop is coming up. So we didn't look into that. We said, oh, that's ARC flux, so they will...
Just for me, for the Southern Ocean, for what the impact is on climate, not doing the fluxes basically lets out a lot of the impact globally of what the Southern Ocean
Yeah, no,
is actually
they're
doing.
super
So
important. It's just
pushing
that
it
the
aside
workshop
is
is
the-
coming up.
No doubt. Especially with your vigor yesterday.
Yeah.